Dear students, welcome to massive open online course on research methodology in history. Today, we shall be discussing about history and archaeology. Archaeological discoveries have always caught the popular imagination. Discoveries like Howard Carter's discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, the excavation of the ancient cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro in India, the wreck of the Tudor warship Mary Rose under the water of the Solent in 1971, the accidental uncovering of the terracotta army of Shanxi province by a local farmer in 1974, the excavation of the remains of Richard III under a Leicester car park in 2015 captured the popular imagination and were among the defining moments of the 20th century. Clearly, archaeology is a part of and has shaped popular consciousness. And just like history, it is a way of knowing about the past. Naturally, history and archaeology share connections. But to understand the nature of this connection better, we need to understand what archaeology is and how it has developed into its modern form. So first we will discuss what archaeology is. The word archaeology comes from the Greek word archaeologia, meaning discourse about ancient things. Today, it has come to mean the study of the human past through the material traces of it that have survived. It is of utmost importance for the archaeologist to transmute his interpretation of the material remains that he studies into historical judgment. However, the relationship between history and archaeology has been precarious. Archaeology has often been belittled as the quote-unquote handmaiden to history, unquote. On the other hand, some archaeologists believe that archaeology is the laboratory where historical theories could be tested. Some archaeologists even complain that historical interest framed the agenda, modes of analysis, and language of archaeological inquiry. It is interesting to note that archaeological evidence has often been used as a political or ideological tool. There have been various attempts to hijack excavations and made them complement pernicious ideologies. For example, in 1931, Gertrude Caton Thompson reported from her excavation of Great Zimbabwe in Rhodesia that the monument was entirely consistent with the medieval Bantu culture. Now, most white Rhodesians, indeed archaeologists, at that time refused to accept that Africans ever possessed the necessary skill and that it must have been built by the Phoenicians or even early Portuguese traders. Only after independence that African origin was acknowledged and the new country took its name from the monument. Another instance, in 1930s, German archaeologists provided tools to promote plans of the Nazi regime to annex newer territories. With the enthusiastic support of the SS leader Heinrich Himmler, archaeologists and scholars undertook work on the remains of lost Viking village in Haithabu in Scandinavia as a means of affirming the German claim over Scandinavia. Since German people had in prehistoric past migrated into and subjected these lands, the German nation had prior claim to them. Now we shall be looking at how this archaeology emerged as a learned discipline. Many scholars trace the origin of archaeology as a discipline in the 15th and 16th century Europe. In the 16th century, the Renaissance humanists look back upon the glories of Greece and Rome. In Italy, collecting objects of antiquities and sponsoring excavations to find more works of ancient art was undertaken with much enthusiasm. Ancient monuments also began to draw interests. Now we shall be looking at some of the developments of the 18th century. In the early 18th century, an Anglican clergyman, William Stukeley, surveyed English monumental sites, including Avebury and Stonehenge. At about the same time, sites of Herculaneum and Pompeii were discovered. Another famous archaeologist, Thomas Jefferson, who contributed to the study of burial mounds, which was scattered over American landscape, containing stratified burials of humans and these burials contained beautifully crafted items. These mounds were thought to have been built not by native Amerindians, but by a race who had migrated from South America or even Scandinavia. However, Jefferson, during his excavations at Monticello, had speculated this link with Native American culture. He used a scientific way to excavate the burial mounds. He made perpendicular cuts in the mounds in order to observe the arrangement in stratified layers, and he recorded information systematically. Now, these pioneering works gradually led to the rise of modern archaeology in the 19th century. Simultaneously, there had been path-breaking discoveries in the intellectual world. For example, Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. In this book, he demonstrated the gradual geological evolution of the earth. This challenged the widely held belief that God created world in 6 days. While Lyell spoke of the gradual evolution of Earth's geology, Charles Darwin spoke of the evolution of the biological world. He demonstrated how the evolutionary mechanism operated. These two challenged the prevalent belief that man was created in the image of God. Darwin's origin of species implied a long past for men. The acceptance of the idea of human evolution created a climate of thought in which archaeology flourished. Now we'll be looking at the developments in the 19th century. English antiquarian Richard Colt Hoare carried out excavation in the sites of Salisbury Plain and Stonehenge, recognizing among artifacts of stone, brass, and iron a temporal sequence on the basis of which stages in the societal evolution would be identified. However, it was the work of Danish archaeologist C.G. Thomson that the stages theory gained rigor and consistency. Scandinavia proved to be extremely rich in prehistoric tools and tombs. Thomson was of the opinion that since all these artifacts clearly suggest a pre-literate time, therefore, people were originally users of stone tools and weapons, then bronze, and finally iron. This formed the basis of three-age typology, which proved remarkably versatile, for it found useful application over the whole of Europe. Thus, the stone, bronze, and iron ages entered into the intellectual realm of archaeology as a principle with which to organize cultures chronologically. These ideas led people to reconsider their understanding of the prehistoric time. Prehistoric times. The concept was pioneered by John Lubbock in his famous book Prehistoric Time, published in 1865. He expanded this three-age system into a four-age system, dividing the Stone Age into the Old and New periods, that is Paleolithic and Neolithic. Pioneering discoveries were made by General Augustus Pitt Rivers. He excavated prehistoric Saxon and Roman sites in England. He pioneered the practice of methodical collection and recording of even the most mundane artifacts. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone and revealed about the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Champollion was followed by William Flinders Petrie, who was able to reveal about the pharaonic Egypt with advanced field technology. Petrie discovered the stela or stone tablet of Merneptah, which bore the first ever mention of Israel in an Egyptian inscription. In North America, in the 19th century, archaeology was driven by the question arising from its own historical experience of interaction with the indigenous people, especially on the American mainlands. Where did they come from? How did they make their way into the mainland of America? Were some of the questions that concerned the intellectuals. As archaeological discoveries were an attempt to answer these questions, one cannot fail to see how archaeology, anthropology, and history coalesced to answer these questions. This calls for a systematic compilation of ethnographic, archaeological, and historical data on the American people. As European Americans moved west, they discovered ever more mounds to excavate in the elusive quest for the race of the mound builders. Caleb Atwater excavated the burial mounds in Ohio. Ephraim Square surveyed over 200 mounds in the Mississippi Valley. These works collectively began to challenge the mound builder myth. Square, along with Dr. Edwin Davis, in their monograph Ancient Monument of Mississippi Valley, revealed the existence of different types of mounds related to distinct aboriginal cultures. In 1839, Dr. Samuel Morton examined nearly 1,000 skulls from the tombs, concluding that there was no significant difference between those mound builders and the contemporary Amerindians. Cyrus Thomas, in his annual report of the Bureau of American Ethnology, put forward the fanciful idea of a race of mound builders. He concluded that mounds had been built by the ancestors of the Indians. The diversity of these mounds reveals the cultural practices of different tribes or nations. By the mid-19th century, Americans turned their attention to other sites, including middens or rubbish deposits scattered along the rivers and seashores. Clarence Moore and William Holmes proved that shell middens were of human origin and that through the systematic collection and ceramic remains, diverse regional cultures could be identified and dated. However, the discipline of archaeology had been extremely gendered place. Women played a marginal role, yet their contribution was no less significant. Harriet Hawes excavated the prehistoric site in Crete. Dorothy Garrod, through her excavations in Iraq and Palestine, opened up the prehistory of Middle East. Gertrude Caton Thompson is credited for her discoveries in Great Zimbabwe. Now we shall be discussing about archaeology and imperialism. It is interesting to note that imperialism had given impetus to archaeological activities. Take, for example, the British colonizers' attitude to archaeological discoveries in India. In the 18th century, Orientalists and philologist William Jones talked about the longevity and the worth of Indian civilization. Under the aegis of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, Thomas Morris published a 7-volume of Indian antiquities or dissertation on Hindustan to describe the Indian temples as magnificent as any found in Greece or Egypt. The British colonizers did not negate the idea of the exceedingly rich past of Indian culture, but they claimed that Indian culture had subsequently declined and degenerated into idolatry and superstition. Now, despite this imperialist perception, the colonial archaeologists made great discoveries to unearth the ancient Indian past as well as its prehistoric past. Some of the outstanding figures were Cornell Meadows Taylor, Robert Foote, and Alexander Cunningham. Taylor came across megalithic tombs in Karnataka. He suggested that these megalithic tombs were similar to sites in Western Europe and therefore must have been built by the Druids who had migrated to India in ancient times. Taylor also prepared site maps, used the principle of stratification, and careful drawing of artifacts and skeletal remains. Alexander Cunningham, too, travelled the whole of North India and prepared detailed site maps and recorded evidence of artifacts, including coins and inscriptions. Now we shall be looking at some of the discoveries. We have already looked at these discoveries. Now, the most important shift that happened in the discipline of archaeology is shift in the focus from discovery of object to theoretical interpretation. In early developments in archaeology were driven by a desire to record and classify ancient remains. In the 19th century, it was influenced by theories of geographical and biological evolution. During the early decades of the 20th century, increasingly sophisticated chronological sequences were devised. Archaeologists were now drawn towards regional studies, and thus foundation was laid for the archaeology of Mayan, Peruvian, Egyptian, Amerindians, Mesopotamians, and Minoan civilization. From mid-20th century, the need for explanation rather than confining archaeologists' activities into collection and organization of artifacts was raised by scholars like R.G. Collingwood and Gordon Childe. R.G. Collingwood was one such historian who had worked in the field of archaeology. He pioneered the way for archaeologists to provide an explanation on societies or historical processes through the lens of material object. In his Archaeology of Roman Britain and Roman Britain and the English settlement. In these works, Collingwood developed archaeological theories. He challenged the artificial separation between material artifacts and written documents. In his idea of history, he argued that a Neolithic man was a historical reality. His tools, that is, flint axes or so on, reveal his spirit. To write the history of Neolithic man, one must be able to enter his mind. He suggested that instead of viewing events from the outside, it was necessary to understand them from within. This can be done by identifying the human values and intentions which determined the particular course of action. He warned that excavations should not be undertaken simply to find artifacts, just like historians should not trawl the written archives to accumulate data. Identifying the purpose behind objects and events and interpreting historical evidence should be the purpose of archaeologists. Competing interpretations may arise, but they are a welcome because they reveal the problems or the strength of previous theories of historical development. He laid down 3 guiding principles for archaeologists. First, excavation should start with the question of what for this excavation is being undertaken. Second, since history proper is the history of thought, there are no mere events in history. What is miscalled an event is really an action and expresses some thought of its agent. The historian's business is therefore to identify this thought. Third, no historical problem should be studied without studying the history of historical thought about it. Another important figure of this period was Gordon Childe. He brought a radical change in the field of archaeology. Some of his significant works are The Dawn of European Civilization, The Aryans, a study of Indo-European origin, The Most Ancient East, The Oriental Prelude to European Prehistory, and The Danube in Prehistory. Gordon Childe challenged the Rankian perception of factual evidence as the basis of historical practice. Instead, he emphasized the role of interpretation and hence theory. He suggested that archaeologists should not limit themselves to the collection of materials, but rather they should have a hypothesis and test those hypotheses with their findings. He further pointed out that historical processes do not operate on the basis of universal laws, but rather through human consciousness. Historical process can be understood by studying the relationship between human agency and material processes. To quote Child, quote, "Archaeology studies all changes in the material world that are due to human action naturally insofar as they have survived. The archaeological record is constituted by the fossilized result of human behavior, and it is the archaeologist's business to reconstitute the behavior as far as he can, and so to capture the thoughts the behaviors expressed. Insofar as he can do that, he becomes an historian." Unquote. Now we shall be looking at the important aspect of our discussion is historical archaeology. The works of R.G. Collingwood and Gordon Childe have established that collecting and studying artifacts cannot be an end in itself. They are of value because they reveal the nature of human cultures. However, the communication between history and archaeology remained precarious in the 20th century. In fact, after Childe's demise, a turn towards new archaeology further increased this distance between the two disciplines. Archaeologists of this era criticized written documents for having little material data about the past. This perception stemmed from the traditional use of archaeology by historians, which were first, archaeological data are used to provide illustration of people, their settlement, and their daily lives. Second, archaeology is made to prove history. Third, when written documents provide little information, archaeology can be useful to investigate into historical past. However, there have been attempts in the 20th century to widen the scope of archaeology and to integrate written and material cultural evidence to reconstruct a narrative of the historical process. As Collingwood had pointed out, assumption was to be drawn from written source and was used to structure the archaeological data. By examining archaeological sources and sophisticated consideration of document proved that neat correlation are flawed concepts. The idea that two types of evidence can be used together at all was rejected. In fact, some scholars argue that there was the possibility of disparagement between forms of evidence, and sometimes the two types of evidence relate to wholly different things and thus cannot be used together. The examination of religion in post-Roman Gaulish cemetery provides a very good example of this problem. Written sources provide the idea that there was dichotomy between Christianity and paganism, but archaeological evidences in the graves suggest that pagan practices continued even after mass conversion to Christianity. So the idea of integrating the two disciplines was still being emphasized by historians, but no methodology was present that allows archaeology an equal and independent explanatory voice. In 1988, a collection of studies of early medieval Britain and Ireland was published with the expressed intention of historical and archaeological evidence from different theoretical perspectives. Driscoll emphasized the value of interdisciplinary study and historiography of historical archaeology. Post-processual archaeologist John Moreland has written on the relationship between history and archaeology. He observed how material culture may be read as text and how text may be seen as a kind of material culture. However, Moreland does not offer a framework for the use of archaeology with contents of document with which most historians work. According to Guy Halsell, the problem of integrating historical and archaeological sources comes from the tendency to use off-the-shelf interpretation from one discipline to shape the interpretation of the other discipline. Now, this has resulted in the borrowing of facts from unreliable documents or the simplistic use of archaeological data. Halsell suggests that data have to be placed in context and as meaningfully and contingently formed by active individuals, and an analogous process of inquiry should be present. An integrative multidisciplinary methodology has to be devised. However, this methodology will require experts to have the knowledge in both the disciplines, and they need to be open to dialogue rather than engaging in competition. If such an approach can be implemented, archaeologists will benefit from consulting documentary evidence, while historians should be prepared to acknowledge the importance of research into material culture. The acknowledgement that history does not have a monopoly on the past and that archaeology can have a fuller explanatory voice will benefit both the disciplines. With this, we come to the conclusion of our discussion. So, this paper has, so far, we have demonstrated how the distinction between the fields of history and archaeology stemmed from scholarly boundaries that places historians and archaeologists in separate academic departments. The hindrance of intellectual exchange between the discipline has often resulted in a fractured understanding of the past. A contextual and pluralistic approach is required for better understanding of the past society and historical process. Thank you.